Good afternoon, and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Jay Willis. I'm going to show you a picture of Yolanda Jackson now, who worked as a special education teacher in Atlanta. Yolanda was laid off in March at the outset of the coronavirus pandemic. She has 2 kids, and she spoke about her fear of being evicted in a recent interview with the New York Times. Here's what Yolanda said, quote, "I mean, right now we're living in boxes. I started packing up in April because the only thing I could think about was when are the marshals going to come and set us out possibly. So I'm just living out of boxes because I don't know when our time is up." Yolanda is one of 40 million Americans who remain at risk of eviction during a pandemic that, despite the onset of a nationwide vaccination effort, seems like it will continue to cause death and wreak havoc on the economy for months to come. Today, January 5th, the country has its eyes on a pair of Senate runoff elections in Yolanda's home state of Georgia that will have a profound impact on whether folks like her can get help anytime soon. These runoffs were necessitated after no candidate in either Senate race won more than 50% of the vote on election day. Those races are between Republican incumbent Kelly Loeffler and Democratic challenger Raphael Warnock, and then in the other, Republican incumbent David Perdue and Democratic challenger Jon Ossoff. Now, as you can imagine, these races don't matter only for Georgians. 98% of the US Senate for the upcoming Congress is settled. 50 Republicans, 48 Democrats. This means, if you're doing some quick math, Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and the Republicans need to win only one more seat to keep control of the chamber for the next 2 years. But with the White House and the House of Representatives under Democratic control, if Democrats win both these races, Vice President-elect Kamala Harris would serve as the tie-breaking vote in the Senate, yielding a unified Democratic government, albeit by the narrowest of possible majorities. The stakes are about as high as they get. Anything resembling a Democratic agenda, as well as President-elect Joe Biden's ability to meaningfully govern, rests on the outcome of these races today. On the campaign trail, Ossoff and Warnock, the Democratic challengers, have unified behind promises to use that power to pass a John Lewis Voting Rights Restoration Act, and in the midst of this pandemic, to get people in Georgia and everywhere else $2,000 relief checks, better health care, housing relief, evictions protections, and so on. Meanwhile, another subplot to all this is that President Trump and his allies have made Georgia ground zero for, let's say, their ambitious bid to overturn the results of the 2020 election. Earlier this week, the Washington Post reported extensively on a conversation between Trump and Georgia's Republican Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, in which Trump alternately urged Raffensperger to, quote, find enough ballots to erase Biden's 12,000 vote margin of victory, and then also threatened Raffensperger with unspecified legal consequences if he were to fail to do so. As Georgians head to the polls today to pick their senators, we are joined by 3 esteemed guests, my colleague and noted Atlanta enthusiast Josie Duffy Rice, president of The Appeal, Aimee Castanel of the Working Families Party, and LaTosha Brown of Black Voters Matter. Now, LaTosha is coming to us live from the bus. She is on the ground right now in Georgia with the Get Out the Vote effort, and we've only got her for a short time. So I'm going to go to her first, and we'll get right to it. Again, LaTosha, thank you so much for joining us. As you've been canvassing and talking to voters throughout this process, what are the main issues that people want to talk about? What's on their minds as they make up their minds?
Thank you for asking me what is on the minds of the people in Georgia. First and foremost, we want to win. We want to get the voters out. There are consistently 3 issues that come up. One, people are really concerned about, they may not frame it in the same way, but the status of democracy. We've seen how it has been weakened under this president. We've seen how those protections around from Black voters to what we've seen in terms of criminal justice reform, all of those things matter. And so there have been 3 things that continuously come up. One is really centered around COVID-19. In a state like Georgia, African-American voters have been particularly impacted by COVID-19. In April, when it was a height of the first shutdown, 80% of all hospitalizations were Black voters in the state that we only make 30% of the population. There are 4 million people, over over 4 million people who are in unemployment right now. And there's scores of businesses, Black-owned businesses, small mom and pop shop businesses that they don't know. They are feeling a sense of uncertainty of knowing when they can open back up. You know, many hospitals in the midst of a pandemic, we've had several hospitals to close in Georgia and rural Georgia in places where they desperately need health access. And so the three things that continuously come up is one, really centered around COVID-19, access to health care, making sure that we have leadership from the Senate office on down that's really going to look out for the lives of people in Georgia, and really be able to make sure that there's a package, that there are resources to support people as they're drowning right now because of how COVID-19 has impacted the state. The second thing, and we're seeing a rise on that, the second thing that comes up continuously is also centered around criminal justice reform. You know, I have to remind people that Ahmaud Arbery, that happened in Georgia, in rural Georgia, who a man was out jogging and he was literally tracked down like a dog from vigilantes who literally killed him, and that district attorney they were not going to do anything about it. It was local organizers that organized and heightened what happened in that case of why people came out, and as a result that DA was removed out of office and was voted out of office in this last general election. The third thing I think that people are really concerned about is they are tired. They are tired of this anti-democratic, white supremacist like agenda, right? They know what it is. They know what time it is. Those of us in the South, we've dealt with it before. We know how dangerous. We don't take it lightly. You know, democracy for some is just a term. For some of us, it's really a context that really we're talking about our survival, that we're literally looking at our community, protection for our community. And so that continuously comes up. Young people who I talk to, they're concerned about what's happening in this country around the protections. They're deeply, deeply concerned about criminal justice reform, and those things continuously come up. And then in a state like Georgia, which has been ground zero for voter suppression, I think what you're seeing, even in the turnout, is that people are responding. I think what the Republicans did not, what they underestimated is how people who had been, their votes had been suppressed, how they will respond. And what we're seeing is people are responding en masse. Just on yesterday, I got a phone call from a woman who heard about a lot about the voter suppression, and then this attempt by the president now to fine 11,000 votes. And she was so upset. She said, I'm taking off work today because I am going to do everything I can to really be able to get people out registered. I mean, get people out to go vote. And so folks know what time it is, and they know what it means when you're dealing with the fragility of democracy and what are the needs right now, what kind of leadership we need.
Yeah, so George, I wanted to ask you about that in particular as you deal with this election today. So Georgia flipping blue was one of the biggest headlines of the 2020 presidential election. Before that, the state hadn't voted for a Democrat since Bill Clinton in 1992, and then before that, Jimmy Carter in 1980. And I know you've been working on getting out the vote, registering voters, you know, well before this 6-9 week sprint in the Senate runoffs. How are you seeing voter enthusiasm for these Senate runoffs in January compared to enthusiasm for the race for the White House back in November?
You know, let me put something in context. What's really interesting is in the state of Georgia, you know, primarily the voters that I talk to are primarily Black voters because that's our constituency base. But there were more Black voters in the state of Georgia that actually voted for Biden than voted for Barack Obama. I'm raising it as a point, right? Because I think oftentimes we underestimate the sophistication, particularly of voters of color and Black voters. And we think that, oh, you just got to get this charismatic candidate and that's going to pull out the voters. No, that's not the case. Certainly, we don't think that Black voters in the state of Georgia were more excited about Biden than they were about Obama, right? So then the question is, what drove them out? And I think part of it has been that people really recognize what at stake, that the stakes are high, that we're in the middle of this huge pandemic. We're in the middle of where we're seeing the criminality of the highest, coming from the highest office in the land. We're seeing where there's an organizing where Trump had aligned himself with white nationalist groups, and we understand what that means for our community. And so what we've seen is people being enthusiastic about voting because they're voting for themselves. They're voting for their own interests. And so I'm raising that in that same kind of context from the Senate race to the presidential elect race. It's not just about the race. I think there's a couple of things that's different. One, you know, in the presidential race, we were talking about what was going to happen all over the country. Now we've had a laser focus on Georgia. And normally when you're talking about a Senate race, most people don't know who their U.S. Senator is. Unless their U.S. Senator is a senior senator, they don't know who their senator is. That's not a particularly sexy race, even though it's one of the most, I always say it's the most powerful, unsexy position, because a lot of people don't know who their U.S. Senator is, right? But however, I think what made the difference this time is that there was a lot of focus on this race because Georgia did have these two outstanding Senate seats, and people have been educated about what a senator does. Like, I've had so many people that said, oh, I didn't know that that's what the Senate does. So the Senate can do this and they can do that, and this is what their role is in Congress. So I think there's a couple of things. I think one, because the focus has been laser focused on Georgia, I think there are more people who've been educated around the significance of the Senate race. I think there's been more energy on the ground to really be able to engage folks in saying that we've got business, we've got work to do. That while we did have part one, there's one thing to get a new president in office. Two, recognizing that you have to have a president in office and to make sure that you have a Congress that is willing to work with him. And what people have witnessed in the last 20 years, we've seen a Republican Party that has quite frankly been obstructionist, right? That have literally not, we have not forgotten how they treated Barack Obama, particularly in the Black community. And I think those things have been factors as well. And I think the third thing too is people are in a different position, that folks really are frustrated with, we're in a moment of uncertainty of where this country is going to go forward. How are we going to make sure that our families are protected from COVID-19, that we're getting the right information, that we have access to the medical care and the medicine? And so all of those elements together, I think, have created the perfect storm. And so I think in many ways, people are more educated about the significance of this U.S. Senate race, more so, and feel it's more relevant to their needs in Georgia than just the presidential election, which was a little bit more decentralized because it was national.
LaTosha Brown of Black Voters Matter, I know you've got bigger things to do today than talk to me, but thank you again for joining us for this brief time, and good luck out there on the campaign trail.
Thank you so much. We are in these streets. I will tell you that the level of young voters, what is interesting, I just want to note that I just gotten word that in this runoff election, that more Black voters have actually voted in the runoff than voted in the general election. I need people to know how extraordinary that is. The truth of the matter is this is a state that has been ground zero for voter suppression. And it's not that voter suppression stopped. It's just that good organizers and organizing on the ground, we've been able to navigate through these waters, use our resources in a way, talk to our community. The message and the messenger matters. And so what you see is a result of hard work happening on the ground, not because Raffensperger has been a friend to voters, because he has not. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, LaTosha. Josie, I want to turn to you now. We've been talking a little bit about what's possible, maybe, with Warnock and Ossoff in office, but it's also worth considering the implications of the status quo. Again, as the appeals resident, Atlanta enthusiast, apologist, between David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler, which incumbent do you think is less objectionable and why?
I mean, they're both just so terrible for every sort of progressive goal we want, and also for democracy. I don't have any doubt in my mind that both of these senators, I mean, they've lost really all sense of morality, all sense of dedication to their constituents. And there's no question to me that over the next 4 years, if they were to be elected, they'd vote exactly the same in every way on every vote. 6 years. I think it's worth noting that at least David Perdue was elected the first time. Kelly Loeffler was appointed and has failed in her duty in pretty much every way to represent the people. In fact, profiting off of their misery and their poor health. And so, I mean, I guess if I had to choose, if I were in the seventh circle of hell and had to choose which one of them I wanted, I'd maybe choose David Perdue, because at least that's a sign of democracy. But overall, I think that it's crucial, not that we win one of these races today, but that we win both. We are looking at two people who have demonstrated no affinity towards the people of this state. And I think Georgia voters are tired of that.
Yeah, it's really sort of a question I thought of as more rhetorical, but I appreciate you taking a stab at it. Just to give some facts for context, Perdue and Loeffler are two of the wealthiest lawmakers in Washington. Forbes estimates that Loeffler and her husband could be worth $1 billion. That's billion with a B. Purdue, a mere 15 million. And as you mentioned, both of them were investigated earlier this year for allegations of insider trading related to early information they received at lawmakers about the perceived or the potential impact at the time of the pandemic on the American economy. I'm not like a big Senate history scholar buff, but I have to imagine that it is the first time in the chamber's history that two senators from the same state, from the same party, were the subject of insider trading investigations during a deadly pandemic. Josie, how would electing Warnock and Ossoff change the dynamics of the Senate if we had that 50-50 split? Is the new villain of progress just, your friend and mine, Joe Manchin? Or does electing Warnock and Ossoff, clinch those $2,000 checks that Democrats and, oddly enough, President Trump have been clamoring for?
I think you have to think of this as whose party is it? And, 50-50 split, it's going to be Joe Manchin's party. We're not going to be ushering in the most progressive era of the Senate, of our time, hopefully. But if we lose one of these races, it's Mitch McConnell's Senate, right? It's Mitch McConnell's Senate. And that's a very different situation. We are talking about the continued siphoning out of resources in communities that need it, the continual destruction of democracy, and the inability for Joe Biden to get done over the next 4 years what he has promised to get done and what the American people desperately need. You think back to 2016 and that the implications of that race were so high. And I don't know about you, Jay, but I do know about you, Jay. I think we both were pretty horrified by the outcome. But that being said, the stakes now are so much higher. People are dying. They're losing their jobs. They can't pay rent. They can't feed their children. We are looking at a real moment of change to see whether or not our government is going to be able to help the people that need it the most or going to abandon them.
Yeah, I think it's rare that an election has such immediate financial stakes for people. But
Right.
This $2,000 check proposal, that's been in Washington for weeks now. And McConnell, as you mentioned, in control of the Senate, has held that up by tying it to the repeal of Section 230, which is a right-wing grievance about social media platforms' libel liability that I'm absolutely not going to get into right now, and the creation of a voter fraud commission to investigate the conspiracy theories that Trump propagates about 2020 in an attempt to sort of appeal to that base.
Mm-hmm.
So Democrats don't want either of those things, and that's why this hasn't gone forward. But if we win these two seats in Georgia today, it'll be Schumer's Senate, and Schumer could bring a clean $2,000 check bill straight to the Senate floor. This is about whether this really is an opportunity to either get that money to people in the middle of this pandemic or not to.
Mm-hmm.
Aimee, I want to turn to you and talk about something that LaTosha mentioned at first, the Republican voter suppression agenda. It's really been front and center over the past few years, especially in Georgia, and especially since Democrat Stacey Abrams' narrow loss to Brian Kemp in the 2018 gubernatorial election. That's an election in which Kemp, who was the incumbent Secretary of State, was in charge of administering the same contest he was trying to win. Now, there's been substantial coverage of the years of work put in by groups like LaTosha's Black Voters Matter and Abrams' New Georgia Project to build and protect the vote. But Aimee, how have you seen this really salient issue of voting rights and maybe the potential for new voting rights legislation play into voter enthusiasm and turnout in Georgia?
Yeah, I mean, LaTosha kind of touched on it earlier when she was talking, but honestly, we're seeing a huge turnout for a runoff election, which is incredibly unusual in this state or any state. I don't think I've ever seen this kind of response to a runoff, and I think it's less about how exciting these two candidates are. You could make an argument for one of them being very exciting, but it's more about people's response to years, and not even just years, but literally decades of voter suppression. And I say this all the time, people need to pay attention to what's happening in Georgia now, and they should have been paying attention always, but certainly now, because voter suppression is not unique to Georgia. It's not like it's not unique to the South. This isn't the only place that voter suppression happens. It happens all over the country. But because we've been dealing with it for so long, we actually know how to respond. And like LaTosha said, like organizers have been working on these issues for decades. People have been figuring out workarounds. We know that Brad Raffensperger is not a friend to voters. Like we've seen the tactics that he's used, like barely skirting the like law to accomplish really, really nefarious goals to limit people's access to democracy. But at the same time, we have a battalion of folks who are ready to like take all that on. We have people like Fair Fight Action who are constantly suing the state because there are things that are taking place that are completely illegal and shouldn't be happening. Like we're getting poll closures all over the place. We're having people move their polling place at the last minute. All of these things that certainly this like voting rights legislation that has the potential to happen if we have some new folks in the Senate who are willing to take it on. But since the Voting Rights Act was gutted, we've seen like instance after instance after instance of extreme amounts of voter suppression to the point where voters are aware and have been like energized by it. Instead of being afraid, people are coming out and they're in droves going to vote because they're just like, there's sort of like a spirit of this is ours and you can't take it away from us. And it's actually kind of beautiful to see people are like really standing up for their own right to democracy.
I just wanted to say a quick thing about that, which is like, I think people often think of Georgia as a really white state, not diverse, like, and that's actually not the case. This is an extremely diverse state that has diverse across all sort of metrics. And it's really just been that of years of Republican voter suppression, and people, I think, in some ways kind of gave up on political participation. We're seeing a change in that direction, and it's really exciting.
Yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the impact of that organizing effort and sort of the way it butts up against the campaign of voter suppression, because it's really hard to sort of evaluate how those two dynamics are interacting, right? If a Republican wins, it's, not enough voters turned out for Democrats. But as we've seen over the years in Georgia, that's just not the case. There are counterfactors that are really hampering Democrats' efforts to win in national elections that we saw finally flip in 2020. So if Democrats do retake the Senate and kick McConnell out of his majority leadership position, it will be because of turnout, primarily among, as Josie says, communities of color. And we see this in the data. So the voter share, the Black voter share of the early vote was 34% as of the end of 2020. That's up from even 31% in the November general election. That's according to an Emory University study. And then we've seen this pattern elsewhere over the past few years, particularly in the South. Although Alabama Democrat Doug Jones lost his Senate re-election bid in 2020, his unlikely win in 2017 really was fueled by turnout among the state's Black voters. I'd like to pose this question to both of you, but what enabled organizers in 2020 to finally cross that finish line and to get the result for which they've been working? What was the tipping point in your view?
I think, in my estimation, I think what we're seeing is really like the result of long-term investment. I mean, I work for the Working Families Party. We've been building in Georgia since 2017. And it hasn't been a really like quick bang kind of action, but we're really having like a lot of like deep conversations with folks, trying to work with groups who have been on the ground longer than us and learn from them, like LaTosha, Black Voters Matter. We've been doing the work of actually like building roots in the state so that when things happen, it's not just like, oh, they were only here for a little while, but now I don't know who they are. We're really building community. And we've seen this summer when we were having uprisings in the street, those young people who are organizing, they're not organizing for a specific campaign or candidate, they're organizing for their lives. And so that kind of like energy and investment has been moved into an electoral space because of what's at stake. And when you have like an urgency from the people mixed with an actual investment from organizations who are saying like, we're here for the long haul, we want to build with you, win, lose, or draw. Because I mean, working in elections, like you can get into this headspace of it being very much like a zero-sum game. Like there's a winner and there's a loser, and if you lost, then too bad for you. But the reality is, like, elections are not that simple. Elections are opportunities always to change how we interact with government, how we interact with people. And so if you win, yeah, that's great. Like, that's awesome. You can't always win, though. Sometimes you lose, and even in the losing, you can gain things. Like, you can gain a better relationship with people who you want to work with. You can gain a better understanding about what needs to happen the next time in order to win. Always there's like a learning that happens, and like that's the work of organizing. Really, it's a lot of losing, and then when you get to a point where you've lost a lot but also learned a lot, you can get to this point where I think we are now, where we're seeing like a combination of this like energy from the people and actual like resources and infrastructure that are being built up in the state. And I mean, lucky in this is like a very strange circumstance where we're also seeing a lot of national attention on a Southern Senate race, which is not particularly like, it doesn't happen. This kind of attention and investment does not happen. But I think if we were to do this all the time, we would see vastly different results across the board.
Last question for both of you. If Warnock and Ossoff were to win, you know, this would have national implications, obviously, but it would also be a significant change in who represents Georgia in Washington. What would you want them to prioritize in the Senate if they win? What message do you want them to carry to DC?
You know, I think traditionally in this state and also in this country, there's been a maybe subconscious, maybe conscious instinct to cater to the moderate Democrat, the conservative Democrat, when you're coming from a state like Georgia, and especially to cater, frankly, to white people, because they hold such a disproportionate amount of political power in this state, disproportionate to their actual percentage of population. I think what I want to see is someone who is willing to make bold and courageous decisions about policy that affects people in this state, right? We understand that states in the South in particular suffer disproportionately when something like a pandemic happens or a recession, right? Because we don't have the state infrastructure to take care of these issues as much as other places do. And so the question is, can Warnock and Ossoff take a victory, no matter how small the margin, and recognize that it really is a mandate from people in this country, this state, who showed up for them, who want to see bold action, and who want to feel like their government is actually doing something. You can say whatever you want about Donald Trump, but he makes people feel like he's doing something, good, bad, whatever. He makes people feel like he's acting. And I think the biggest concern that I have about the Democratic Party over the next few years is, will they approach this session with courage instead of timidity, and make people feel as if the government is doing something for them?
Thanks, Josie. I know we're at the top of the hour. Aimee, I'd love to give you the last word.
I mean, I couldn't agree more with what Josie said. This is if Ossoff and Warnock are to take this and win, they need to go to the Senate with the idea that they do have a mandate from the people, particularly from Black people and people of color who have turned out and turned up for this election in a way that has never been seen before in this state or any other. And they cannot go in there with any kind of timidity. I think Josie's exactly right. And I hope they win. I hope they do it.
Wonderful. Well, again, I know we're at the top of the hour, so I do want to thank our guests for joining us today from Georgia, Josie Duffy Rice, LaTosha Brown, and Aimee Castanel. If Georgia voters, do send Democrats Raphael Warnock and Jon Ossoff to the Senate today, instead of incumbents Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue, it will give President-elect Joe Biden the chance to help people get their kids to doctors, to pay rent, and to cast a meaningful ballot in their elections. It's not an exaggeration to say that these elections will decide the fate of the country for the next 2 years. These are the most consequential Senate matchups in generations, and Georgia organizers are hoping that their years of hard work are going to pay off in a big way today. Again, thank you for joining me here on The Appeal Live. I'm Jay Willis. Please follow Appeal News on Facebook and The Appeal on Twitter for more news, shows, and updates just like this one.